Peter Lalor, his life and times. When people think about Peter Lalor today, the first thing that comes to mind is his role as leader of an armed uprising against the Crown in Australia. While I will focus on the rebellion at the Eureka Stockade in Ballarat in 1854, I would like to talk briefly about his family background and his life. Peter Lalor was born on the 5th of February 1827 at Tinnakill in Raheen Parish in Laois, or Queen's County as Laois was known at the time. Peter was the youngest of 12 children. He was born into a well-off family. His father, Pat, was a very substantial and prosperous tenant farmer. Pat became involved in resisting an unjust tax known as tithes. At that time, Church of Ireland clergymen were entitled to collect a substantial tax from the laity. As the Lalor family, and indeed the majority of people in Ireland at that time, weren't members of the established church, they deeply resented paying what they rightly considered an unjust tax. Pat Lalor played a leading role in resisting the tax and helped have it abolished. As well as his role in the tithe wars, as it was known, Pat also became the first Catholic nationalist MP for the Queen's County in Westminster in 1832. His close identification with the struggle for repeal of the Union of Great Britain and Ireland, his friendship with Daniel O'Connell, and his stance against injustice led to his being known as Honest Pat Lalor. As a small boy, Peter Lalor saw at close hand his father stand up strongly for what he believed in and resisting what he saw as injustice. Peter was educated at Carlow College and at Trinity College, Dublin, qualifying as a civil engineer. The 1840s saw increased political radicalisation in Ireland and indeed across Europe. Daniel O'Connell and his repeal movement became increasingly challenged by young radicals known as Young Irelanders. These were led initially by Thomas Davis, Charles Gavin Duffy and John Mitchell, and they were later joined by Peter Lalor's eldest brother, James Fintan. James Fintan Lalor articulated a very clear vision for an Ireland freed from British rule. His ideas and powerful writings were not initially successful, but were to inspire Michael Davitt and the Land League and profoundly influence Patrick Pearse and James Connolly many years after his early death in 1849. Peter was inspired by both his father Pat and his brother James Fintan. Both his father and brother disagreed, to say the least, with each other politically, but each was driven by a hatred of injustice. The years after the Irish famine of 1845 to 51-52 saw widespread emigration. Over 1 million Irish people died in the famine, and well over 1 million left Ireland for Britain, America, and the colonies. 3 of Peter's brothers emigrated to America. Peter and his brother Richard went to Australia in 1852. Peter found work on the construction of the Melbourne-Geelong Railway. Both brothers also set up as partners with another Irishman in Melbourne as wine, spirit and provision merchants. In 1853, Peter left Melbourne for Ovens, where gold had been discovered in 1851. Early in 1854, Peter left Ovens for the gold diggings at Ballarat. His brother Richard returned to Ireland. Now, gold had been discovered several years earlier in California, leading to the famed gold rush of 1849. In 1851, gold was found in Victoria in Australia and led to a similar frenzied hunt for gold. Men flocked to Australia from many countries to try and strike it lucky as miners, or diggers as they were known in Australia. Between 1851 and 1861, 500,000 people, many of them in pursuit of gold, came to Australia from Britain alone. The gold was found in such vast quantities that during the 1850s, a third of the world's produce of gold, or a third of the gold produced in the world, came from the new Crown colony of Victoria. Australia had only recently been settled by Europeans who supplanted the indigenous people they called the Aborigines. Originally established by Britain in 1788 as a penal colony, known as New South Wales, by the 1850s, Australia had developed agriculture and trade, encouraged European settlement, and had recognised a second Crown colony to be known as Victoria. This new colony of Victoria had only been established in 1851. It was faced nearly straight away with the problems associated with the gold rush. With adventurers and fortune seekers pouring into the new colony, increased expenditure was required to maintain law and order. It didn't help matters when virtually all the Melbourne police force quit their jobs to go digging for gold. The Conservative landowning legislature was reluctant, to say the least, to fund additional law officers, so the Lieutenant Governor introduced gold licence laws. The licences were set at 30 shillings a month, which was a considerable charge at the time, equivalent to a half ounce of gold. Protests about the miners' licences caused unrest across the goldfields. Representations were made to the governor, but in vain. In 1854, a new governor, Sir Charles Hotham, was initially welcomed by the miners. However, when he examined the colony's accounts, he discovered, first of all, the colony's accounts were in rag order, and he secondly discovered that nearly half the gold licences were unpaid. He called for stricter enforcement. Miners were approached by troopers on licence inspection several times a week. Failure to produce a licence meant a £5 fine or prison. Severe enforcement and brutality gave rise to considerable resentment. In Ballarat, the spark that led to the miners' rebellion was the murder of a miner by a hotel owner. The release of the suspected murderer, John Bentley, triggered a series of events that led up to the rebellion. When Bentley was released from prison, a large gathering of miners protested outside his hotel in 17th of October 1854. Amid growing anger and disorder, the hotel was burned to the ground. A small number of soldiers present weren't able to prevent this happening. Less than a week later, the arrest of 3 miners for the fire led to a mass meeting of miners. A meeting of 4,000 miners agreed to establish a Diggers' Rights Society. A week later, on the 1st of November, there was a further mass meeting of miners at Bakery Hill. On 11th of November 1854, more than 10,000 miners agreed to the formation of the Ballarat Reform League. It was chaired by a Chartist, John Barrett Humphrey, and several other of the leaders also were Chartists, supporters of democratic political reform, which was regarded as incredibly radical at the time, but would be regarded as very commonplace now. It was agreed at the meeting that it is the inalienable right of every citizen to have a voice in making the laws he is called on to obey, that taxation without representation is tyranny. It was also agreed by the meeting to secede from the United Kingdom if the situation didn't improve. Following the meeting, attempts were made to negotiate with Governor Hotham and the Gold Commissioner Robert Reid. Sir Charles Hotham appointed a Royal Commission on the 16th of November to look into the miners' grievances. But while the Governor was at least listening to the miners and he set up an inquiry, the authority figure present in the goldfields, Commissioner Reid, was a slight bit tougher. He increased the police presence on the goldfields and looked for military reinforcements from Melbourne. When they arrived on the 28th of November, they were attacked by a crowd of miners and several soldiers were injured. On the 29th of November, the Reform League delegation told a crowd of 12,000 miners of the failure of negotiations. In other words, the gold licence hadn't been abolished. The miners present agreed to burn their licences and openly confront the authorities. Well briefed by his informants at that meeting, Reid had the police carry out a full licence search the next day, which of course led to heated confrontation. It also led to the moral force leadership of Humphrey and others being replaced by those who favoured physical force. Peter Lalor was elected as the new leader. Under the Southern Cross flag on the 1st of December, he pledged, "We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties." This pledge, known as the Eureka Oath, was pledged by Lalor and affirmed by all the other miners present. The flag, the Southern Cross flag, was designed by Henry Ross, a Canadian miner, and was also known later as the Diggers' Flag. 60 years later, a flag inspired by the stars in the Northern Hemisphere, the Plough and the Stars, was to fly in Dublin in April 1916. After the pledge swearing ceremony, about 1,500 miners marched with Lalor to the gold diggings at Eureka and erected a stockade. While some of the miners were armed and began drilling, most of the miners went back to their own tents for the night. At dawn the following morning, an attack was launched on the stockade on the orders of Commissioner Reid. The battle lasted just 15 minutes. 6 troopers and approximately 25 miners died. Among the wounded was Peter Lalor. He was spirited away by friends into hiding and had an operation which cost him his arm. The battle, while fierce, was terribly one-sided, a military regiment facing untrained miners. Over 100 prisoners were marched off to the military camp. 13 men were charged with treason. A reward was offered for the capture of Peter Lalor. The miners who were charged with treason were tried in Melbourne in early 1855. Juries found the men not guilty and they were released to public acclaim. Better luck than the poor editor of the Ballarat Times was found guilty of inciting the miners, and he served 6 months in jail. The inquiry set up by Governor Hotham reduced the cost of a licence to £1 a year and gave the miners who bought a miner's right, that was the new name for the licence, the right to vote. Although the miners' uprising was quickly suppressed, there were immediate and long-term consequences of the revolt. In the short term, the miners' grievances were addressed with regard to the oppressive miners' licence. Of greater significance was the granting of the vote to those miners who bought a licence. Public support for the miners also resulted in all charges being dropped against Peter Lalor. He emerged from hiding, married his sweetheart Alicia Dunn, late of Mountrath, was elected member of the Legislative Council for Ballarat in November 1855. He was elected to the new Legislative Assembly of Victoria in 1856. He was later appointed Postmaster General and Commissioner of Trade and Customs. In 1880, he was made Speaker of the House of Assembly, and he died in Melbourne, 9th February 1889. The debate about the significance of the uprising at the Eureka Stockade continues to this day. Nearly 50 years after the uprising, Mark Twain said of it, "I think it may be called the finest thing in Australian history. It was a revolution, small in size but great politically. It was a strike for liberty, a struggle for principle, a stand against injustice and oppression. It is another instance of a victory won by a lost battle. It adds an honourable page to history. The people know it and are proud of it. They keep green the memory of the men who fell at the Eureka Stockade, and Peter Lalor has his monument." Not everyone agrees with Mark Twain's assessment. While most people saw that the miners were being treated unjustly, not everyone saw the need for a resort to arms. Australia today is regarded as one of the most democratic and inclusive countries in the world. Was this in part inspired by the miners standing against injustice in 1854 and raising the Southern Cross flag? Peter Lalor himself continued in Parliament for over 30 years, and as I mentioned earlier, became Speaker of the Victoria Parliament. Lalor made a very interesting observation in a speech to the Legislative Council in 1856 when he said, "I would ask these gentlemen what they mean by the term democracy. Do they mean Chartism or communism or republicanism? If so, I never was, I am not now, nor do I ever intend to be a Democrat. But if a Democrat means opposition to a tyrannical press, a tyrannical people, or a tyrannical government, then I have been, am still, and will ever remain a Democrat." In Stuart McIntyre's A Concise History of Australia, published in 1999, he says, "The Eureka Rebellion became a formative event in the national mythology of the Southern Cross flag became a symbol of freedom and independence. Radical nationalists celebrated it as a democratic uprising against imperial authority and the first great event in the emergence of the labour movement. Here in Laois, we commemorate Peter Lalor as another of the Lalor family who stood up to injustice. Like his brothers James Fintan and Richard, and his father Pat, his memory will be green forever. Thank you.